Welcome, everybody. Good to see you. Camilla, I'm going to let you do the introductions. I'm going to get us going on Facebook here.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our town hall. So for those of you who are familiar with us already, I do see some familiar faces. We have these meetings weekly to support Montessori leaders out there so that they can have a space to come and learn from each other, as well as just gain support. We know that being head of school or being a Montessori leader can be quite a big role to fill, so you can definitely find support in this group. Today we're going to be joined by a really special Montessorian who has presented with us before, and he's come back to talk to build upon the subject he originally came in, and that is Michael Dorer. Michael holds several Montessori credentials, was trained internationally and has taught students from age 2 to 14. He's been involved in Montessori education for about 50 years now, Michael?
It is. This is the 50th this year.
It's incredible. And yeah, he's going to be talking about the importance of storytelling and how it can be so impactful in Montessori community. So I'm going to let him take it from here. He's put together a presentation. So yeah, Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you, Camille, for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to start off with a story. So I'm going to switch over and share my screen, if I'm able to do that.
Yeah, you should be able to. Perfect.
There we go. So one day, the Noun family was out taking a walk. Now, you probably know a little about the Noun family. The Noun has a big vocabulary, many, many words, but they're all nouns. So as they're taking a walk, the Noun can only say things like grass, tree, river. But luckily, along with the family comes the adjective. So between them, they can say things like green grass, long walk, big river, deep river. And then they have the article who can help them so they can make a whole phrase like the green grass, the deep river, the blue sky. And they were just enjoying their walk so much as they walked alongside of a river. And then across the river, they saw another Noun family who was doing the same thing, also taking a walk and calling out happy things like the green grass and the blue sky, the white clouds. And they began to call back and forth across the river, trying to gain each other's attention. But they couldn't get together because the river was in the way. And so they couldn't come together. They couldn't somehow join up with each other in any way. But as they walked along the river, they noticed an old green bridge down the way, just a little ways. And when they came up to it, the first Noun family said, the deep river. And the other one said, the green grass. And then the bridge spoke up and said, across. And they realized, across the deep river. Who are you? They asked that green bridge. Who are you that lets us cross the bridge? And the bridge answered, they call me the preposition. And that's my job here, is to put you Noun families in relationship to each other. So that's an as yet unpublished story about the preposition and our first introduction to that as a part of speech. And that's typical of the kind of story that I like to tell, which is what I call a curriculum story, where it's tied into something in our curriculum. Today, we're going to talk about the power of storytelling. And that's me, Michael Dorer, and I'm really glad to be here and be able to speak with you. As we talk, you may have some questions, and that's fine. But make a note of them, and at the end of the time, we'll have a block of time allotted so that you can ask questions. A lot of what I say today will be based on this book, The Deep Well of Time. And actually, I have a copy of it right here. The Deep Well of Time is my book on storytelling, but I am in the process of releasing a new one, which is called Grammar Tells a Story. And what you just heard will be in this new book, Grammar Tells a Story, that will be stories about the preposition and lots of other things too. But right now, what is storytelling? What does it mean? Well, it means a lot of things to different people. So some people think of it as meaning writing a novel or putting on a dramatic production or a play or even an opera. Some people think of it as even journalism. And journalists say, I'm telling the story of such and such. When I use the term, I mean specifically oral storytelling, that is spoken storytelling. And it uses the voice, but it also can use the face, it can use hands, it can use, if I were with you, and I wish I were, it would use body movement, and I'd be able to get up and move around the room with you, and I tend to do that a lot. Usually in oral storytelling, the teller and the audience are in the same room together. And we're in a virtual room, aren't we? We're sort of in the same room together. But if I had things the way they could be ideal, we would all be together, gathered around. And that's the most traditional form of education, by the way, that there is in the world. The most traditional form of education is storytelling because it goes back more than 100,000 years before writing, before reading, and certainly long, long before formal schools were ever established. So storytellers are part of a long tradition. Stories can be all sorts. They can be myths, they can be truth, they can be fantasy, they can be imaginative, they can be all sorts of things. But one thing about stories is they're universal. Every single culture that's known in the world or has ever been in the world, so far as we know, has told stories. Not every culture has discovered reading and writing, but they all have storytelling. So it's a universal, across the globe and across history phenomenon that we're participating in. Something I didn't know when I first got started in storytelling many years ago is that it's also a spiritual act. And I didn't think that. I didn't intend it to be that way. But what I discovered as I tell stories with young people is it raises the spirits of all of the children in the group. And it makes them bond in a special way with this teller, with me, or with you if you're the storyteller. And it also raises the spirit of the teller. So there's a mutual spiritual benefit in telling the stories. And please understand, spiritual and religious aren't the same thing. I'm not saying it's religious, but it does raise the spirit of all of the participants, either the tellers or the children who are listening to it at the same time. So I'm going to tell you a story, and this is also an unpublished story. And this is a story that is in my new book. It's called A Cafe Story. We'll see what you think of it. The new book, remember, is going to be called Grammar Tells a Story. So all of the stories are grammatical and language in nature. Three sentences walked into a cafe. They looked about and they decided on a spacious booth. It was an Indian restaurant. The first of the three sentences was a quite large fellow who was given to stating the obvious. The second sentence was oddly dressed. She wore an imperial crown like a king or a queen, and she walked haughtily with an imperious royal manner. The third sentence, dressed mostly in gold, she appeared to be highly excitable and even a bit jumpy. Well, the three of them sat down and examined the menu. And just then a waiter appeared, wearing a costume completely covered with question marks. Looking at the three of them, the waiter asked, "What would you like?" The sentences did not respond. They just kept looking at each other or at the menu. And once again, the waiter asked again in an inquisitive tone, "What can I get for you?" The first sentence, the largest one, finally spoke. "You are full of questions," he said. "It is not necessary to interrogate us." He then went on to declare, "The butter chicken looks very nice." With that, he smiled and looked around. He usually did that, simply saying some kind of information. When the waiter still looked questioningly at them, the second sentence, that's the one with the crown, commanded, "Bring me the butter chicken." She always spoke that way, making orders or commands. It went with her crown and her way of acting like royalty. When the waiter finally brought their orders, the third sentence was the first to taste the food. "Wow! This is spicy curry," the somewhat jittery sentence exclaimed. "Is everything okay?" asked the inquisitive waiter. Well, you may have noticed that each of these four sentences always acted in character, always the same way. The waiter was always full of questions, always asking, inquiring. He's called an interrogative sentence. Interrogative comes from a word that means to question. He's always full of questions. The sentence that declared that butter chicken looks good is a declarative sentence. He's so large because most sentences are declarative. He just tells information, true or false. He's just saying. The haughty sentence, dressed in the royal crown, likes to give commands. When she ordered the waiter, "Bring me the butter chicken," that was a command. She's an imperative sentence, which means imperial, like an emperor. She's always commanding. And then the third sentence, remember, waited till she was served, and then upon tasting her food, she said, "Wow, this is spicy curry." She always speaks with excitement. She is an exclamatory sentence. She dresses always in gold, like the interjection, who is her friend. She's always exclaiming in excited terms. After dinner, the three sentences got up to leave. The three sentences got up to leave. "We are leaving now," said the declarative sentence. "You go first," said the imperative sentence. "How slow you walk," said the exclamatory sentence. With that, the three sentences left the cafe, heading for home. The waiter stared into the night as the three sauntered away. Who were they, he wondered. So that's an attempt to take sentences and do something we call personification. Turn them into as though they were people and they can speak. They each have a personality. I hope you like the story. I tried to create a personality so that when children think about sentences, they can think about, oh, that one dressed all in gold, or possibly the one that wore the crown, and so on. And the waiter who was covered with question marks. And that can be what I call a memory hook that can help them come back and remember it at some time in the future when they're asked. Well, let's talk about why we use stories. And if I were actually with you right now, I'd say, let's have some talk about that story and how it worked and what you feel about it. And did it help you to understand the sentences in a different way? Do you think it would work with the children in your classroom? It has with the people that I've tested it with. Why do we use stories? Well, the first reason is something I call the gift of the memorable. You know, if I ask each one of you, what do you remember about elementary school? None of us remember every last thing. You know, and neither do the children we've had in school. When I ask children, they don't say something like, oh, I remember stroking the sandpaper letter T. Oh, that was a big moment when I noticed that when I built something with the red rods in primary. They don't seem, I mean, that's there, but there are certain things that stand out. And there are things that stand out because they are wonderful, and some things that stand out because they were bad. What we want to do, what I want you to do, is consciously build wonderful moments into the children's day. Moments that are memorable, not just good lessons, not just good presentations, but something that's going to stick. Stories fall into that category. And when I've talked to people, believe it or not, there are people who are in their 50s that I once had in class when they were young. That's kind of, man, that does age me, doesn't it? But there are people at that age, and I say, what do you remember when you were in my class? And almost everybody mentions a story of some kind or a dramatic production. That's what stands out. So when we're doing this, we're creating a memory, a conscious creation of a memory, and it's a good one. Now, there are a lot of other reasons we can do stories in the classroom. One is holism. Holism is a way to give a whole entire picture of something that is too big to actually deal with otherwise, like a story about the whole creation of the universe. There's no way you can go to the shelf and I say, Camilla, go to the shelf and go get me the universe, would you please? No, she could get the pink tower, she could get the golden beads, but the universe, she'd just look at me blankly because it isn't something that's an object. But I can tell you a story, and the way that you can understand the entire universe is really only one way, and that's through your imagination. It's so that you can use your imagination to travel to ancient Rome. You can use your imagination to go to another planet. You can use your imagination to understand the whole creation of the universe. You can use your imagination to wonder about what might have been the first word ever spoken by human beings. And all of those can only be gotten through story, through imagination. It also helps to develop listening. Of course, if I ask you, do you think children do better in class if they listen? Well, that would be a ridiculous question to ask because it's so obvious that children who listen well do well. But how do you learn to listen well? Well, in Montessori's world, you learn something when it's isolated. She calls that isolating the difficulty. So if we focus on listening, which we can do with stories, then when we're in an arithmetic lesson, an algebra lesson, a grammar lesson for that matter, a history lesson, a biology lesson, that skill of listening can be utilized because we learned it during storytelling. And good listeners, as I said, do well. It also helps develop literacy. And some of you may think, but literacy, Michael, that means reading. That means letters, print, and you're just talking. But if you can remember with me, who were those 4 sentences after all? What was the name of the one that was dressed all in gold? What was the waiter called? Then you're using comprehension. You're recalling the main characters. And that oral comprehension is directly transferable to reading, in which case we call it reading comprehension. But we've isolated the difficulty again and put the comprehension into the story. And then that transfers to reading, where it's really important. And of course, imagination I've mentioned. So it engages the imagination and develops creativity, especially when we get to the point that children too begin to retell stories or even create their own. But there's something else that's a bigger reason, I think, a yet huge reason, maybe even the biggest reason that we should tell stories with children. And that is children love them. If all of those other things are true, and they are, and also children love stories, then shouldn't we be doing it? Shouldn't we be doing this if it was only that they love them, but stories were somehow not so good? I don't know, but they are. And children line up for stories. They say, Mr. Dorer, could you tell that story about the cafe again? When children ask for lessons and they come back and they say, this is one of my favorites, could you do it again? You know you're on the right track. You know there's something good when that kind of thing happens. So I'm going to tell you another story. This is actually one of the first stories I ever wrote way back a long time ago. I back probably 30 years ago when I first did this. And this is a story called The 4 Strange Brothers. And again, it uses personification and something called anthropomorphism. And that means turning something that's not human into being like a human, like when animals talk in fairy tales and so on. But here, well, stick with me and see what you see. And then I'll ask you to reflect on how this story makes you view the topic, the subject matter, maybe in a different way. Okay? When I tell a story, I always start sort of with a deep breath, get into character. I'm going to tell you the story of 4 strange brothers. Oh, the people around them all thought they were very strange, but it's going to be up to you. You can decide what you think about these 4 brothers. Let's go to their house and let me tell you a little about each of them. The first brother dressed completely in red, always in red. He wore a red shirt, a red hat, red pants, and even red shoes. And on his chest was embroidered this strange symbol in red. And he loved one thing more than anything else, and that was to put things together. He loved to put things together and make more. He'd run around the house and grab whatever he could find. If silverware is around, he'd take 3 knives and 2 forks and 2 more forks, and that would be 7 pieces of silverware, 3 plates and 2 more plates, that's 5. He'd find 6 apples and 5 apples and 1 more apple for 12 apples and make that into a little pile, always putting things together to make more. Of course, that made messes in the house, and I said, you might think they're a little bit strange. But he had a brother, and his second brother dressed entirely in gold or yellow. He had a golden shirt, a golden hat, golden pants, and even shiny gold shoes. And on his chest was this symbol sewn. And he would say, I can do the same thing as my older brother. I put things together to make more too, except I can do it faster. 3 apples, 3 apples, 3 apples, 3 apples. There's 12 apples just like that. 4 pencils, 4 pencils, 4 pencils, 4 pencils, 4 pencils, 20 pencils, just as quickly as that. I can go so quickly with things, much more quickly than my older brother, but I still put things together and make more. I like to do that. And you can imagine the piles start to accumulate around the house, but they had a third brother. And the third brother dressed entirely in green. He had a green shirt, green hat, green pants, and he even wore green shoes. And on his chest was this green symbol. And he just loved to take things away from others. He loved to go and take things away. So when they had the piles built up, his older 2 brothers, he would go around and take things away. There were those 12 apples all in a pile. He'd take away 3 of them and leave just 9. There were 7 pencils that had been put in a pile. He might take them all and leave none. In another place, he discovered that his oldest brother had put together 4 cookies and he ate every one of them and left none of them at all. He just loved to take things away and leave less. Some people saw him as a troublemaker, but this is what he liked to do. But there was a 4th brother too. And this 4th brother dressed entirely in blue. He wore a blue shirt, a blue hat, blue pants, and he even had blue suede shoes. Yes, he was completely dressed in blue, and on his chest he had this symbol. And he said, I just like to be fair. I like to pass things out to everybody so each person gets a fair share. An apple to you, an apple to you, an apple to you. And he'd go around like that until everybody had exactly the same number. A pencil for you, a pencil for you, a pencil for you. People loved him because he was so fair. Well, one day, down in the village nearby, they had a great orchard filled with apple trees that grew golden fruit. wonderful golden apples, but a great windstorm came through. And that windstorm destroyed, well, it knocked all the apples to the ground. And there they all lay. And that's when the four brothers happened upon that orchard. They came walking along. And the first brother said, well, I know what to do. I will put them together. 2 apples, 3 more apples, that's 5. 2 more apples, that's 7. There's a pile of apples. 6 apples, and 1 more apple is another 7, and 2 more is 9. There's another pile of apples. And he went around piling apples up until all of a sudden he said, wait a minute. I have a name for what I do. I'm going to call this addition. I'm going to say I add when I put things together like this. Now the villagers looked at him like he was a little bit silly, but they all murmured addition and learned the word. But his second brother always thought he could do things faster. And he said, I can clean up these apples too. I can pick up the apples, 2 apples, 2 apples, 2 apples, 2 apples, there's 8. 6 apples, 6 apples, 6 apples, 18, just as fast as that. 5 apples, 5 apples, there's 10 in a pile. Then he too stopped. I said, well, I also have a name for what I do, even though I'm just doing addition, like my older brother, much faster. I call it multiplication. I multiply when I do my repeated addition. And once again, the villagers looked on and murmured, multiply. But our troublemaker, oh yes, he was there too. The third brother was busily undoing the work that the older 2 had done. He was going around taking away the apples and scattering them back on the ground. He was undoing it. There was that pile of 12. He took away 3 of them and left only 9. If he could, he'd eat an apple. When there was a pile of 3, he ate 1 and left just 2. He took away and undid the work they were doing until he stopped and said, well, I too have a name for what I do. I call it subtraction. I'm subtracting. That means taking away. And that's just what I love to do. And the villagers looked disapprovingly at him, but they murmured subtraction. And that finally, what happened was with 2 of them putting things in piles and only 1 taking them away, finally all the piles remained. And that's when the 4th brother stepped forward. He said, wait, I think I have a solution here. I will pass out the apples to all of the villagers and everyone will get an equal fair share. And that's exactly what he did. 1 to you, 1 to you, 1 to you. And he went around and gave them all the same exact number of apples. And they were happy. That's when he said, I call this division or dividing. Division means sharing out equally. Everybody gets an equal share. And with that, the 4 brothers smiled, put their arms around one another, and headed back to their house, leaving the villagers in a happy state. And do you know what? That is a true story. Well, or if it's not, it ought to be. So that's the story of the 4 strange brothers. And it is obviously a story, it's a math story. It's obviously a story of arithmetic. And as I said, I'd ask you throughout it to think about, what is it accomplishing? Can it help you in some way to see addition, multiplication, subtraction, and division in a way in which it helps to understand? You can understand it better. A new vision. Well, in Montessori, there are 8 major kinds of stories that we tell. Let's talk about those for a second. So you know that there's more than one kind of story. First of all, there are great lessons, and those are taught in the age 6 and above. There are only 5 of those, and that's why they're special. And the great lessons are told at least once every year, usually in the fall. They could be told another time. They could be told 2 or 3 times in the year, but usually at the beginning of the school year, for sure, they are taught at that time. Then there are curriculum stories, and that story of the 4 strange brothers is one. So is the story of the preposition. Stories that talk about something that would normally be in our Montessori curriculum. Then there are origin stories. Origin stories tell how something got to be the way it is. Great lessons are actually a kind of origin story, but they're so special, they get set aside. Biographical histories are stories of famous people, great people, heroes, people that we want the children to look up to, like Maria Montessori, for example, or perhaps Maria Curie, or Albert Schweitzer, and many other people that we could look up to. A personal story is much the same thing, except it's about me. If you tell a story about yourself, let me tell you something that happened when I was a boy. That's a personal story. It's a special kind of biography. And it's usually about one incident, something that happened at one time. A narrative, some people think, isn't a story at all. Maybe it's not, but it's told like a story. It feels like a story, but it doesn't have a plot. It doesn't have characters. It doesn't have any rising and falling action. I'll give you an example in a bit. Character development stories are stories that deal with qualities of character, like honesty, generosity, kindness. And then creative dramatics is when you can act a story out. So biographical histories, I just talked about a little, and I'm going to give you a personal story about my dog, Mooch. Now, this is what I call a nothing story. You'll realize as I tell the story, almost nothing happens in it. But the children have loved this and asked for it over and over. I wonder why. Well, when I was a boy, I lived in the far north, where it gets very, very cold in the wintertime. And we had a dog, a black Labrador named Mooch. He was a hunting dog. And my dad had built a big doghouse, an insulated doghouse, and a large kennel outdoors, and that's where Mooch lived. He never, ever, ever, ever came indoors, even though we lived where it was very cold. In the wintertime, one year, it got so extremely cold. My mom went to my dad and my mother said, I think we should let Mooch inside. It's so cold, I'm afraid he'll get frostbite. It's really cold out. But my dad said, no, Nancy, he's a hunting dog. He's an outdoor dog. He has to be tough. And that was the end of that. Well, for about 15 minutes. And then she came back and said, please, Pat, I think he should be let inside. Let Mooch come inside. Well, he didn't like that idea. So he said, no, Nancy, that's not going to happen. He can't come inside. Toughen him up. Then about 15 or 20 minutes later, she tried for the third time. And she came to him one more time and asked, can't we let Mooch come inside? Please, it's so cold outside. And I think for some reason she softened him and he said, all right, just this one time, we'll let Mooch come inside. And then my mom turned to me and she said, Mike, you run outside right now and go out and get Mooch. Go on, go get him right now. So I went outside and the snow was very deep. It was up, I was about 10 years old. It was up to my hips. And I waded out all the way through the snow until I got to Mooch's kennel and he was bouncing around there. What are we going to do? We're going to have fun now. And I opened the gate and he came running out and leaping through the snow, which was of course way high on him, but he still loved it, and went leaping through the snow. And I took him to our back door and I opened the door and said, come on, Mooch, come on, come on. But he crouched down and put his tail between his legs and started to back off. He'd never been inside the house and he sure didn't want to go there. Whatever it was inside, he was afraid of it. He didn't want to go there. I said, come on, Mooch. He wouldn't do it. So I went inside and I said, Mom, he won't come. He doesn't want. She said, you're bigger than he is. You go outside and grab his collar and bring him in. So I had to do that. I went out and I grabbed a hold of his collar and pulled, and he put his paws out and tried to stop this and spread his feet out. And he didn't want to come inside, but well, I managed to get him in through the door. And once we got inside, he crouched up against the door as close as he could to outside. He was kind of scared. We got him some water, we got him some food, and we put down a nice mat for him to sit on or lie down on. And then we went to bed. Well, the next morning when we came down, there was Mooch still sitting up against the door. I don't know if he'd sat there all night long or if he'd managed to sleep at some point, but he was warm. And that was what we wanted. He was not frozen. And he started to scratch at the door, and my mother said, I think you should let him out now. So I opened the back door, and that dog bounded out in a great leap into the snow, which was as high as his back, and went leaping through the snow. We had a big yard, and he went leaping all around this huge yard that we had 3 times, round and round and round, like, I'm free, I'm free. I don't think I'd ever seen such a happy dog. And that was the one time that we ever let Mooch in the house. And that's the story of Mooch and his day indoors. So you see, I could tell you that story in a quick way. I could say, once I had a dog who never came in the house. One day we let him in the house. He spent the night there, and then we let him go in the morning. That's what I mean by a nothing story. But when you embellish it, for some reason, the children love this story. And then they want to say, Mr. Dorer, I have a dog. Or I have a cat. I don't have a dog, but I have a cat. I mean, it induces sharing. It causes them to communicate and share. I don't have a dog, but I'm asking my mom for one. And on like that. And so and then they come back. Could you tell that story about Mooch again? When I put this story together in the first place, I thought this will be a flop. But it wasn't. Surprised me. It's been very successful. Now I want to tell you about a narrative. What is a narrative? Is it really a story? Some people think so. I do. Some people think, professional storytellers say, no, Michael. I've talked to a couple people that say you should get that out of your storytelling book. That's not a story. Get that out of the deep well of time. That doesn't belong there. Well, let's give you an example of what I mean. Have you ever heard people say, which came first? The chicken or the egg? The egg or the chicken? The egg, there's the egg, or the chicken. The chicken or the egg. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, they may think, well, it can't be the chicken because the chicken had to hatch out of an egg. It can't be the egg because the chicken had to lay the egg. And usually they don't really mean it. They mean, this is a question that you can't really answer. In fact, some people say, well, that's a chicken and egg question. Chicken or egg, but I'm going to answer it for you. I'm going to tell you which came first. The chicken? No, it was the egg. You see, long, long ago, during the Permian period, the surface of the earth began to dry up. Now, the predominant animal, the predominant land animal at that time were the amphibians. And the amphibians have to breed in the water. They lay eggs in the water. They are born in the water. And when the water dries up, and they have to live near water because they have a damp skin. And if they're far away from the water, they die and they can't reproduce. So they were threatened. In fact, that was a great die-off during that time of amphibians worldwide as the earth dried up. This was a terrible time for them. And in fact, it was a threat to life on earth during this period of time. But that problem obviously was solved because we're still here. What happened? Well, someone came up with a great idea. Instead of putting an egg in the water, what if you put water in the egg? Instead of laying the egg in a pond, put the pond inside an egg. But if you do that, how can you stop the egg from just shriveling up and drying up, which is what would happen with the amphibians' eggs? And so the shell was invented. And this is not just any shell. It allows oxygen to enter, but stops water from evaporating. so that it can be laid on land. And this is a special kind of a thing. It's called an amniotic egg. An egg, and the liquid inside is called the amnion. And that means there's an ocean, a pond or a river inside the egg instead of the egg inside the water. What an incredible idea. Who was it that came up with this idea? The reptiles. This was something that was invented, if you want to call it that, by reptiles. The reptiles also came up with another idea, which is, if that works so well, that shell, why not cover our entire bodies with something that would do the same thing, would hold the moisture in? And those are scales, and they covered themselves with scales, unlike the amphibians. And as a result, the reptiles spread all over the earth. They populated the whole earth. They populated even deserts, mountains, rivers. They swam. There were even flying reptiles. They were everywhere. They were the most successful animal by far. Why? Because of the egg. And what about the chicken? What about the chicken? Well, at this time, birds had not even evolved yet. There were no birds on Earth, and a chicken is a bird. There were no birds, so the egg was there first. The chicken is a few million years ahead, and when we get to the chicken, and the birds, we'll tell a story about them too. But now you know that the egg came first, and later came birds like the chicken. So that's a narrative. It's really a lesson told as though it were a story. That's why some people say it's not a story. It's, as Michael, that's a lesson. But the children treat it like a story and love it like a story. I'm going to skip this little part about adjectives because that's from the book that's not yet out. And I want to tell you about something I call Libra. I know that sounds kind of like books, and that's why I chose the word. Libra is 5 steps for how to learn how to tell a story. If you want to be a storyteller, what can you do? Well, follow these steps. And the L stands for listen. The first thing you should do is listen to a good storyteller telling a story. The story should be told without a book, without pictures, and then you create in your mind your own pictures as you're listening to the storyteller. Try to do it face to face, where the story, you can see engaging expression and hand movements and body movements, which I can't fully do here. Look for emotions, look for movement, look for vocal dynamics when the voice goes up and then goes down. Look for various intonation, because you're going to want to copy this as best you can and then make it your own. Here's a story. You all know that the noun is the head of a great family, the noun family. The noun has the most words of anything at all. And the noun names everything. It names Michael, Camilla, Camille, computer, table, chair, mooch. It names everything. And along with it, it has its loyal partners. Those are the adjective and the article and the pronoun. Now, the pronoun is taller than the noun. The noun is a black triangle or a black pyramid. The pronoun is much taller. And the pronoun approached the noun and said, I can do better than you. You have all those words, but I can get by with just a few. Instead of all those names, I can just say she, or it, or him, or her. I don't need all those words. You bore me with all your words. Well, the noun didn't like to hear that. The noun started to fume because it seemed like the prince, the pronoun, was trying to take over the role of the king, of the emperor, was trying to take over and kick aside the great noun. The noun doesn't like that. And the noun kept saying its words, and the pronoun kept saying she, her, him, himself, it, my, mine, and on like that, until finally the noun had had it and said, you may no longer be in the family of the noun. And as a result, the pronoun went over to the verb and is now a loyal member of the family of the verb. And when we do what we call conjugation, we'll find out we have to use the pronoun all the time because it serves the verb. And that's how come, that's what made the pronoun join the verb family. And as we study the verb, we'll see that it belongs there. Well, now I'm going to ask you to take a story like that and get out a piece of paper and divide that paper into sections, 6 sections ideally, and start to draw using stick figures the various things that happened. Begin by drawing the very first thing in the story, which might show the noun and the pronoun together. Then go all the way to the end of the story, and you can draw the pronoun and the verb together. Then in between, draw each step, and don't worry about your artwork. This isn't about artwork. This is about, actually it's a storyboard. You're going to be able to look back at this and use it as a reminder as you tell the story. It will help you to identify the key points, and you can actually hold that. Eventually you'll discard it, but you'll hold it for a while. And remember, don't worry about, this is not an art project. So don't worry about your art. That's not the point. Then figure out your movements. Are you going to move around the room? We call that blocking. That comes from theater. Are you going to move in a certain way? Are you going to, in fact, move your body? Are you going to come forward? Are you going to grimace? Are you going to smile? What are the movements that you're going to do? There you're blocking. Then you have to rehearse. You have to practice. Read the story over. I always practice in front of a mirror. I like that because the guy that's in the mirror is such a good-looking guy and he's always smiling and happy. So he's never critical of me. So I like that. But I also tell it to my family. And my wife Rose is here and she's heard all these stories so many times, it's ridiculous. But also my kids. And then you can do it with colleagues and friends. And finally, after you've practiced a lot, you should learn the story by heart, but not memorize it. So that every time you tell it, it's a little bit different. That's part of what brings vibrancy to storytelling and spontaneity. Now you're finally ready for action. Tell the story. Tell the story as best you can in your own words. And of course, initially, this isn't going to sound perfect. You're going to find, but let the show go on. Do your best to tell the story, because in time, you'll get fluent and smooth with the telling of the story. So if you follow Libra, listen, go back here and let's take a look at it again. Listen, illustrate, block, rehearse, finally act. You will be a storyteller. And these 5 steps will help bring you into the world of storytelling. When you tell a story, tell it. Don't read it. You can read it to yourself. Reading aloud, though, is different. So if you're going to read aloud, do that. But if you're going to tell a story, you want to tell the story. Now, if you want to create your own stories, I suggest you begin with personal stories like Mooch. Stories because every one of us has stories that we lived. And we can tell those usually without any research or anything, stories that are our own and go back to us. And another way is to base it on a folk tale or a fairy tale and take that folk tale or fairy tale and insert new characters so that it fits whatever it is you're trying to teach. Okay? Or you can use a story starter like this. The cat peeked into the bag. She saw, I wonder what. Who can help add to that story? And then children add from that point on to what might have been seen in there, and then what happened, and then what happened, and then what happened. So I'm going to skip over this because I have so much I would like to tell you, but I do want to tell you this. You need to start telling stories. One of the biggest things about telling stories is to begin, to get started. Do it. Some people have a fear about stories. I can't do it that well. I'm not a good storyteller. Yes, you can. You can do it. You can be a good storyteller, and you probably are, except that you may lack faith in yourself. But the children will love you. You'll never have such a great audience as a group of kids in the classroom who will be so grateful and happy to hear the stories. And you can see it in their faces and in their attitudes. And if it bothers you and you're somewhat embarrassed, close the door to your classroom so the other adults don't come in, and you don't have to worry about that. And you're there with the kids because they will love it. Even if you make mistakes or you mess up, they don't care. And remember, I said that'll happen, but you'll get more smooth with it as time goes on. But I know the first stories I told in the classroom were terrible, and the children loved them. And that gave me confidence. And I think that can happen to every one of us. So do it. You can bring the power of storytelling to your own classroom. You can be in charge of this excitement that can happen with storytelling. And then you need to share about it. Tell other people in your school. Tell the head of school. Let the administrator or head of school know the power of storytelling. And if you're an administrator, if you're a school leader, help and empower the teachers to tell stories. Encourage them, support them, because that will help them to be successful with storytelling. And try it yourself. Go into a classroom and give it a shot yourself. You can encourage what Montessori called the child's great power of imagination. That is a huge power that we can encourage or discourage. And we want to encourage the power of imagination as much as we can. Once again, the stories mostly came from the Deep Well of Time, and a couple stories that I gave came from my upcoming book, but you can get the Deep Well of Time from Parent Child Press, and they're online, and you can they're part of Montessori services, and that's where the stories came from. So let's turn to any questions or thoughts or ideas that you may have and you've been patiently holding on to during this time. So I'm going to turn it back to Camille and Camila to see if anybody has any questions that they've put in that I can help with.
There aren't any questions in the chat, but be excited to see to hear any thoughts. My first thought was, wow, I wish I had had you to teach me math. I think I would have remembered a lot more because I always did with that one subject in school. But the way that it was explained, I can tell why the children would really respond well to that.
And they do. They do. And one of the things that comes up sometimes is you have difficulties with some lessons or some subjects. Some things are just hard they're just difficult for us for one reason or another. And maybe they have resulted in unsatisfactory results with the kids who aren't excited for some reason by it. That's when you need a story. That's when a story can really help, because that can solve that problem. The excitement and the fun of the story can bring them into the lesson and be a hook that makes them excited about the lesson and does exactly what you just said, gives them something to remember and hold on to.
I'd be interested to hear if anyone here has tried storytelling in their school's curriculum, or if they've had any of the teachers at their school use this as a teaching tool. Feel free to comment if you do.
Well, I was a teacher with toddlers for many, many years, and I always use storytelling and encourage my parents. I think about the stories that about nothing, or you were saying nothing stories. Um, how, like, for example, if a child was going, to have the tubes put in their ears, I would encourage the family to tell the story of what was going to be happening. Tomorrow, we're going to go to the
Mhm.
hospital, and you're going to go to sleep. And when you wake up, I'm going to be here. And just like very simply, telling them the story of what's going to happen to them. And I just, like I discovered that with my own children and have shared that with many families.
Mary, that's a wonderful thing, and I didn't talk about that kind of story particularly, but that is a kind of a subset of what people call therapeutic stories that can be given after the fact when a child has become nervous, or in your case, as you were talking, what's really brilliant is before the fact, preparing them for what may be a challenge of some sort, like a medical or dental procedure or many other things, staying overnight somewhere with grandma for the very first time in their ever in their life. You see, stories deal with us on so many levels. They deal with us on an intellectual level, which is a lot of the kind of story I was telling, and an emotional level, which is what Mary's talking about. And I think that it's a tool that it's usable in so many situations, the telling of stories. And I have always been successful with telling stories of just about all ages, including toddlers, but all the way up through teenagers too. Well, actually with adults as well. So you cannot say, and you didn't, Mary, but if anybody is tempted to say, oh, well, I work with toddlers, so it's not appropriate. Wrong. It's appropriate at every level. And I do it in teacher education as well. So thanks for sharing that particular one, Mary. I really like that.
Can I share? I have used storytelling, especially the curriculum stories, but also personal stories, throughout my career in the classroom, which has hopefully children remember those stories, and they're very positive about it. And the enthusiasm and the new understanding that children have of some of these very complex ideas and subject matter really gives them an enthusiasm for that subject. And it's oftentimes they will ask for, would you tell that story again? Or when they come for parent conferences, they will ask you to tell the stories to the parents so that they can understand that too. And not only does it inspire the children, I've found that storytelling helps me to become more in love with the curriculum and everything that we teach. So it increases my enthusiasm and understanding as well as the children's. So I found it very, very useful.
You touch on something that's really important there, which is that storytelling is a mutual act. It's something that there has to be an audience and a teller, and the interaction between them is where the magic happens. And I think that's really important because when you're live with children, you see on their faces, you see reactions to which you can respond. And that makes it a living thing. So thanks for mentioning that part, Rose. It's really an important part. Now I see Lindsay here, Lindsay Pollock. I'm glad to see you, Lindsay. Lindsay is a school administrator, or now a retired school administrator. And I'd invite you, if you have any, oh, there you are in the tropics, Lindsay. You're probably actually in Houston. By the way, Camilla is also a Texan originally.
Yeah, I grew up in the Houston area.
But Lindsay, What do you think a school administrator, head of school, can do to help encourage storytelling among the faculty?
I think one thing school administrators can do is to use storytelling in their own practice, to start faculty meetings with a story, and to even share picture books with your faculty. I know that's something that I used to really enjoy leading with my faculty, just be to start off with a story time. And I think modeling that value is really important. And even telling stories about a student that you encountered or something you saw in a classroom or running into an alum from your school, all of those things just really help people understand our interconnectedness and begin to relate on a very personal level what it is that we're trying to communicate with them as leaders.
Thank you for sharing that. It makes me realize that I needed to say something I didn't say. And that is, some people see storytelling as, well, they've actually said it to me, what they call the icing on the cake. And what they kind of think is, well, when I get done with the important stuff, then maybe I'll have time for storytelling, or maybe not, but I've got the important stuff to do. And what I want to say is that is the important stuff. If you can motivate kids, if you can help children to be excited about lessons and excited about school and wanting to be there, and you can help them to be encouraged to be creative, well, that is the cake. That's not the icing, that's the cake. And that's what's going to empower kids to continue to learn, is when they're thrilled about learning, when they're thrilled about, I want to come to a lesson. That kind of thing is powerful.
Are there any more comments or questions before we wrap up this meeting? It was lovely to hear Michael's perspectives on storytelling again. If you didn't hear from our original town hall with Michael, I recommend going back to that one as well, because it's fantastic. We have the recording in our collection. I think it was from a few months back, I think maybe August. So if you go back to our inner collection, to our past town hall recordings, you'll be able to find it. But he also touched upon some great topics in storytelling there as well, especially from a leadership perspective. So I recommend taking a look at that as well. His work is truly inspiring.
Thank you for saying that. At that one, we were talking about storytelling and what's called executive functioning.
Yes, correct.
And that whole notion of how kids think, and does storytelling help with that? Well, of course I said yes.
Well, Michael, it was an absolute pleasure having you. You're always more than welcome to join our town halls. Next week, we are going to be talking about fundraising. Is that correct, Camille? Our topic is fundraising. So if you're in a position right now, this time of year especially, where you're trying to brainstorm fundraising strategies for your Montessori school, we're going to talk about that. Hopefully people will come and bring some ideas about what they're doing at their school as well. But we look forward to that. And we hope to see you guys next week for that meeting as well.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah,
Have a
thank
great
you.
day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.